Well, as the Christmas songs indicate, next Sunday will already mark the first week of the Advent season. But until then, until we go full Christmas next week, in the few weeks that I've had available since our conclusion of the study of Mark, I've been taking the opportunity to address a few of the big questions that people often wrestle with in relation to putting their faith in God. So far, drawing upon the wisdom of Christian thinkers like C.S. Lewis, Oswald Chambers, Timothy Keller, we've talked about the question of exclusivity, which is concerned with Christianity's claim to be the only source of truth and salvation in the world. And then a couple of weeks ago, we questioned the idea of human suffering, the problem of a supposedly good God allowing pain and tragedy to touch the lives of his creations. And this morning, we're going to turn our attention to another major criticism of putting your faith in God. Put simply, that it's all just a bunch of rules. There was an early 20th century social activist named Emma Goldman who once called Christianity the leveler of the human race, the breaker of man's will to dare and to do, an iron net, a straitjacket, which does not let him expand or grow. Goldman felt that the church stood in the way of progress by dictating morality to the masses rather than allowing them to think for themselves. She was a fairly rare individual in her time, but now, over a century later, a growing portion of the Western world seems to agree with her. And I can see how people feel this way. Most of the things the average person knows about the Bible, if they didn't grow up in that environment, are ideas like the Ten Commandments or the concept of turning the other cheek or the culturally conservative views that we tend to hold in the area of morality and human sexuality. And then, of course, we all hold these under the threat of eternal damnation. So in his book, The Reason for God, Timothy Keller quotes again a couple of young people, young New Yorkers. He planted a church in New York called Redeemer Presbyterian, where he served throughout the later half of his life. And he would often hold question and answer periods. And so he would often quote these in this book. And these two New Yorkers, they kind of summed up a lot of the negative public opinion out there at the heart of this issue. For example, one of them made the statement, Christians believe that they have the absolute truth that everyone else has to believe or else. And another added, a one-truth-fits-all approach is just too confining. The Christians I know don't seem to have the freedom to think for themselves. I believe each individual must determine truth for him or herself. And that's really what it comes down to here. One of the most important cultural ideas of our generation, the idea of identity. We want to determine who and what we are for ourselves. And anything that might try to suggest there is a greater purpose and meaning for our lives is seen as too restrictive. Identity has always been a central focus of the human heart. Who am I is one of the two, I would say, great existential questions of life, right up there with what is the meaning of all of this? And I believe that those two are interconnected. Our identity, our sense of identity, informs our sense of purpose. For many cultures of the past, identity was tied to our role within society, usually with a specific family or clan and the place where we fit into our family system. But as the separation between the noble and working class developed and the Industrial Revolution took place and people moved away from those clan, family, farm-based situations, We saw people begin to be identified by their contribution to daily life instead. And so we have this legacy, especially in the English language, names like farmer, cooper, shoemaker, and smith, they all come out of this tradition. And we have similar last names in other traditions as well. In North America today, however, we no longer tend to define ourselves by who our parents or grandparents were, or even by what we contribute to society. For the most part, we now want to define our identity through absolute freedom of choice without limits. What I mean is that individual identity and personal morality are becoming completely separated from our relational connections and traditions, which sounds liberating, but it creates problems as well. See, in the West, our ideal has slowly shifted from duty and social obligation toward the freedom to pursue whatever we like. In the United States, they codified this. They sum it up as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And the Supreme Court in the U.S. once even offered this official legal opinion on that statement. They said, the heart of liberty is to define one's own concept of existence and the meaning of the universe. And although we refer to this as the American dream, we've certainly copied and pasted it up here as well. And in both of our cultures, north and south of the border, we haven't stopped there either. You see, philosophers call this type of freedom positive freedom. Not positive necessarily in the sense that it's good versus negative being bad, but positive in the sense that positive freedom is the freedom to do something, a freedom toward a chosen goal. So positive freedom is like the ability to choose how we want to spend our day off, or what we want to eat for lunch today, or even what we want to pursue as our career. That's positive freedom. But as a society, we haven't really been happy with that. And now our societal standard has shifted toward what we call negative freedom. And again, not negative in the sense of bad, but negative freedom is the freedom away from constraints. Freedom away from duty, away from obligation or anyone's opinion but our own. So this is the freedom to not be told what you have to do. Not be told that you have to go to school, or that you have to get a job, or that you have to obey the rules that don't suit you. And as this absolute negative freedom slowly becomes the chief moral good, our new cultural proclamation seems to be, you can't make me do anything I don't want to do. You can't tell me I'm not anything that I want to be. And they might add, as long as it doesn't interfere with someone else's freedom. Which you can imagine will soon become an impossible game to play, as everyone's distinct and individual sense of morality and negative freedom clashes with everybody else's. The inherent problem with this approach is that there's less and less room for the possibility of a sense of absolute truth. And when truth becomes relative in this way, there can be no real purpose beyond our own self-interest. What I mean is that when it comes to principles that the majority of people would agree to define as good or just or even selfless, if we were to ask why they felt that way, why they would agree that those things are good or just or selfless, when we have this individualistic approach to things, we can only really come back to what we each individually determine to be subjectively good for us, or good in our opinion. And without real shared external purpose, we find this ultimate loss of identity. And whether it's realized or not, this is what the prevailing secular opinion seems to be teaching. It seems to be teaching that true freedom, absolute in both the positive and the negative sense, essentially rests upon the belief that there is no ultimate purpose for which we were created. Because if there were, well, then we would be obligated to conform to that absolute sense of purpose, that ultimate purpose. We'd be obligated to fulfill it. And that would be limiting. So then, true freedom is seen as the freedom to create your own meaning, your own purpose. Define for yourself what you are fulfilling or ought to fulfill. Which, whenever I talk about this subject, it makes me think of a quote I used many years ago. I can't remember where I first encountered it, but when I thought about using it again today, I realized that maybe it's becoming a little bit outdated because it's a quote from Oprah Winfrey. And I don't know if some of our younger people even know who Oprah Winfrey is anymore. She's certainly not as prolific as she once was. But she's a famous journalist and talk show host. She had a daily talk show for many, many years. And she eventually became a sort of spiritual guru at the height of her influence. And she once said, this, "What I know for sure is that you feel real joy in direct proportion to how connected you are to living your truth." I always think that's just such a fascinating statement. She knows that for sure. And a lot of people would agree with her. That you'll be happy as long as you get to make the rules for yourself and then freely follow your own set of rules. Christianity then looks like the enemy of social harmony, doesn't it? Cultural adaptability and even authentic personhood. But I would argue that there are some philosophical and theological mistakes that are taking place here in relation to the nature of community, Christianity, and truth itself. A major influence on our secular world in this area is the French philosopher Paul-Michel Foucault. He was one of the 20th century's foremost thinkers on the relationship between power and knowledge. And just to give you a sense of where he fits in, he passed away in the 1980s. He was primarily interested in the ways that power is used in human society to control or define knowledge. In fact, he believed that truth is not an inherent concept in nature at all, but instead that it's a product of human interference. That humans are defining what truth is and then imposing it on other people. He said that it is produced only by multiple forms of constraint that includes the regular effects of power. In other words, rather than each of us determining our own truth for ourselves, what we think of as truth is, in his opinion, actually being determined and enforced by those who have the strength to do so. The most obvious example of this would be that cliche idea that history is written by the victors. He says it's the people who have power, the people who have strength, the people who have the ability to coerce others, who are deciding what truth really is in the world. So then whenever you claim to have the truth that I ought to respect, you're really just trying to gain or maintain control over other people. Within this mindset, even if you claimed that everyone should, say, seek justice for the poor, for example, the obvious question then becomes whether or not your assertion comes from a true love for justice as a concept in itself, a true love for the poor, or because perhaps you actually wanted to start a movement or even a revolution that would give you control and power, or even just notoriety. But we already touched on this sort of flawed argument a few weeks ago when we were questioning the exclusivity of the truth claims of the Bible. Because here's what it comes down to. If you say that all truth claims are just power plays, then so is your own statement. This argument literally destroys itself. Because if it is itself a truth claim, isn't it? So if you say that all truth claims are manipulative, then so is the claim that all truth claims are manipulative. How are you supposed to believe someone who claims that everyone is lying to you? Lies certainly do exist, but all truth can't be relative. We know that there has to be something, at least some kernel that can be uncovered that really is universally true. In his book, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis once wrote this. He said, "You cannot go on explaining away forever. You will find that you have explained explanation itself away. You cannot go on seeing through things forever. The whole point of seeing through something is to see something through it. It is good that the window should be transparent because the street or garden beyond it is not." Then he says this, he says, "What if you saw through the garden too? A wholly transparent world is an invisible world. To see through all things is the same as not to see at all." Does that make sense? If everything is relative, we have no foundation point with which we can begin understanding anything. And really, no grounds from which we could even argue that everything is relative. So then, if you want to say that all truth claims about religion and God are just psychological projections invented to deal with guilt or insecurity or a desire for power, well then unfortunately so is your statement. To see through everything is not to see. Instead, I hope you can accept that there has to be, at the core of it all, real, actual, true, or false realities that would then have a necessary impact on our attitudes and our behavior, our purpose and our goals. You could argue that we don't know what those truths are, maybe, but it's hard to argue that they don't exist. And if we must then agree that there must be such a thing as absolute truth out there, that means that some things in this world must be yes and others no. This is why Christianity can't simply be completely, unquestioningly inclusive, nor can any other type of human community. You see, Christianity requires particular beliefs in order to be a member of its community, which means that it's not open to all, at least not without some personal transformation of heart. You cannot come to Christianity without being willing to change anything about the way you think and enter into that community. And so critics argue that this is socially divisive because they believe that human communities should be completely inclusive, open to all on the foundational basis of common humanity alone. But again, this is too simple because even the most open community is still founded upon some sort of foundational set of particular beliefs. In the West, that's usually defined as a shared commitment to reason, rights, and justice, even if we don't always agree on what each of those terms even mean. But that naturally creates exclusivity, even here in Alberta. Think about the town that we live in. Let's think about Edson for a moment. What are the bare minimum requirements to live here in Edson? Well, you pretty much just have to want or need to live here, right? Like the bar is pretty low. That's pretty inclusive. Not quite though, right? Because you also have to meet the conditions set out to legally live in Canada in the first place, either through birth or through the immigration process. And of course, you also have to be able to pay the cost of living to live in Edson, and you have to obey the law. We pretty much universally agree in Canada that people who break certain major rules are no longer allowed to live in our communities. This seems obvious, but it also demonstrates our argument because we all agree that there are particular beliefs and behaviors that exclude certain people from our community. This is then true with different standards of every type of community possible, from a town to the board of a charity to a bowling league or a troop of Boy Scouts. Any community that doesn't hold its members accountable for some set of specific beliefs and practices, they really have no corporate identity and they're not really a community at all. We can't consider a group to be unjustly exclusive simply because it has some sort of defined standard for its members. Without shared values, it's just a list of names or it's a crowd of people. Community isn't possible without shared identity and purpose. A community then shouldn't be judged on necessarily on who it lets in, but how and why they're letting people in. It's the identity and the purpose that matters. And so, I want to say that we, as in Edson Alliance Church, we do hold to a very traditional and we believe biblically based view of what it means to belong to the kingdom of God. And yet, I would say that we don't consider ourselves to be very exclusive because we welcome anyone to attend our services, our programs, our events. We're glad for whoever decides to join us, even if they are maybe openly hostile to what we believe, as long as they're willing to be respectful while they're here, of course. And if you really want to belong within the community of Edson Alliance Church, even then, you don't have to have it all figured out, do you? You don't even necessarily have to agree with us on every single point. All you have to do is to be willing to express that you are on a personal journey of trying to figure out who God is and who we are to Him. That's the core of our common identity and purpose. It goes deeper than that, of course, but that's where we all start and what everything else flows out of. We believe that this journey is essential to what it means to be truly human. To seek God is to discover self and be transformed through that discovery. And yet, critics still say that Christianity is a limit to personal growth and potential because it constrains our freedom to choose our own beliefs and practices. Another example of this, the philosopher Immanuel Kant, for example, he defined an enlightened human being as, quote, one who trusts in his or her own power of thinking rather than in the authority or tradition. This resistance to authority in moral matters is now a deep current in our culture. As we've already explored with identity, freedom to determine our own moral standard is considered essentially a necessity for being fully human. But the problem is that freedom can't be defined in strictly negative terms, that freedom away from obligations we talked about in the beginning. Because as we've seen, without obligations of some kind on some level, we have no community. And we possibly have no identity either. In fact, in many cases, confinement and constraint are actually a means to liberation. I'll just say that again in case you didn't catch it. In many cases, confinement and constraint are actually a means to liberation. Let's think about this practically. If you want to learn to play an instrument and really master it, you have to practice, and practice, usually for years. And yet, it's also true that for some of us, it won't matter how much we practice an instrument, will it? We won't be able to master it. There's some sort of inherent talent that some people have. Some people can learn it. Some people are, just seem to be attuned to it. They have the knack, and others, it just doesn't matter. Can't carry a note in a bucket. In the same way, it isn't only a disinterest in the fame and fortune that steers most people away from a career in the NHL. It doesn't matter how hard some of us might dedicate our lives to it, we would never be able to be a professional athlete. So my point here is that discipline and constraint can be a good thing, and they're necessary in a lot of areas of life, but they really only liberate us when they fit within the reality of our nature and our capacities. And some of those nature and capacity things are universal to human beings, and some of them, as I've already discussed, are individual. But Keller offers the perfect illustration to make sense of what I'm trying to say here. This is what he says. He says, a fish, because it absorbs oxygen from water rather than air, is only free if it is restricted and limited to water. If we put it out on the grass, Its freedom to move and even live is not enhanced, but destroyed. The fish dies if we do not honor the reality of its nature. In many areas of life, then, freedom is not so much the absence of restrictions as so much as finding the right restrictions, the liberating ones, the restrictions that fit with the reality of our nature and the world to produce greater power and scope for our abilities and our deeper joy and fulfillment. So then experimentation, risk, and making mistakes, they only bring growth if over time they show us our limits as well as our abilities. We can't just invent a set of personal truths and then pursue our truth with discipline and expect results. It's like a child planting a jelly bean tree in the backyard. We understand this in every other area of life. If you want to be physically fit, you have to restrict your diet and constrain yourself to an active lifestyle, which I'm clearly not doing myself. If you want to be intellectually strong, you need to study. If you want to advance vocationally, you need to be diligent and trustworthy. There are no shortcuts. There are no alternate paths. So why, when it comes to spirituality, are we so opposed to constraints founded upon sound wisdom? If we are to believe that everyone ought to determine our own morality, then we're required to convince ourselves that the spiritual realm, the spiritual aspect of life, is nothing at all like any other area of life. And I don't think any reasonable person would really believe that. Yes, the Bible does, from a surface view, contain a lot of rules. But in reality, as we walk with God, we begin to see that these rules aren't what we thought at first. We begin to see them in a new light. The outside world, and maybe even some of us within the faith, we often see these rules as barriers. We can see them as obstacles, holding us back from what we want or what we think we need. But in reality, the constraint of the Bible's principles are not barriers, but guardrails. A railing that keeps your car from driving over a cliff is not stifling your individual freedom. It's leading you toward the best path for a fullness of purpose. I don't think anyone, when crossing that bridge over the Pembina River in Evansburg, says, "Oh, those barriers, those are holding me back from my potential. If they weren't there, I could fly for a very short period of time." Christianity is only restrictive so far as we believe that it contains the core truth of life as laid out by the author and creator himself. The instruction manual for safety and hope, so far as it can be had in this limited existence. As we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the same way that your car's manual will tell you what type of fuel and oil to use, what size of filters and tires to put on it. In Galatians 5:1, Paul declares, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery." And yet, the freedom he's talking about is the freedom to become children of God. The freedom to join a family, to join a community, which, as we've already argued, requires certain constraints. Let me read a paragraph from Keller's book as we continue. This is what he says. He says, "For many years after each of the morning and evening Sunday services, I remained in the auditorium for another hour to field questions. Hundreds of people stayed for the give and take discussions. One of the most frequent statements I heard was that every person has to define right and wrong for him or herself." He says, "I always responded to the speakers by asking, is there anyone in the world right now doing things you believe they should stop doing, no matter what they personally believe about the correctness of their behavior?" They would invariably say, "Yes, of course." Then I would ask, doesn't that mean that you do believe there is some kind of moral reality that is there, that is not defined by us, that must be abided by regardless of what a person feels or thinks? Almost always, he says, the response to that question was a silence, either a thoughtful or a grumpy one. All of us are already living by the restrictions of a moral code of belief. All that matters is whether the restrictions of our beliefs come with a freedom that is worth gaining, or one that is ultimately hollow and self-serving. So then what's the key here? What is the moral, spiritual reality that we need to acknowledge to thrive? What is it that we should constrain ourselves to? What is the environment that liberates us if we confine ourselves to it, like water liberates a fish? I believe that the answer the Bible presents to us is love. Because love is actually the most liberating freedom loss of all. Keller puts it this way. He says, one of the principles of love, either love for a friend or romantic love, is that you have to lose independence to attain greater intimacy. If you want the freedoms of love, the fulfillment, security, sense of worth that it brings, then you must limit your freedoms in many ways. You cannot enter a deep relationship and still make unilateral decisions or allow your friend or your beloved to say no say in how you live your life. To experience the joy and freedom of love, you have to give up your personal autonomy. Love limits our personal options, and yet human beings are most free and alive when they're in relationships of love. We really only become ourselves when we're in relationships of love, which makes perfect sense knowing all that we do about God's intention that we would live in community. We are built for relationship, for loving relationships. And yet healthy love relationships involve mutual unselfish service, a mutual loss of independence. Another famous quote from C.S. Lewis that I've referred to many times over the years, I think it's from his book, The Four Loves. In it, he writes this. He says, "Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to make sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully round with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken. It will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The alternative to tragedy, or at least to the risk of tragedy, is damnation." I've said it before that love makes us vulnerable to pain, to loss, to tragedy. Love costs, but the freedom that love brings is worth the risk. It's worth the constrainment. For any love relationship to be healthy, there has to be mutual loss of independence on some level. We call this trust. When we love someone, we trust them not to hurt us. We make ourselves vulnerable. And it really only pays off if both parties say, "I will adjust to you. I will change for you. I'll serve you, even though it means a sacrifice for me." Because if only one party does all the sacrificing, the other does all the commanding and consuming, then the relationship will be oppressive and it's going to ultimately distort the lives of both people. Which is exactly why, even again, if they don't know how to say it, people often think that a relationship with God must be inherently dehumanizing, crushing, constraining. Because surely God would never bend to us, would never adjust to us. There must be only one way with a being such as God, his way. And you know what? This is often true of many forms of religion that propose a belief in a higher power. But it's not really true with Christianity. Because what we see in the gospel is not a tyrant who would force us to submit to his will, but rather a father and a creator who, in the most radical way, has adjusted to us. When the Word took on flesh, when Jesus walked the earth and died for our sin, he became a limited human being. He constrained himself and submitted to our condition. Paul talks about this in Philippians 2. He says that being in very nature God, he still didn't consider equality with God something that he could use to his advantage, but rather he made himself nothing. And then it says, being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. How profound is that? God has said to us in Christ, I will adjust to you. I will serve you, even though it means a sacrifice for me. God provides us with guardrails, not barriers, instructions and commands for our good, intended to lead us into a fullness of life within his love, an invitation to bend to him, even as he bends to us. A friend of C.S. Lewis's once asked, is it easy to love God? And he replied, it is easy to those who do it. In response to this, Keller wrote, that is not as paradoxical as it sounds. When you fall deeply in love, you want to please the beloved. You don't wait for the person to ask you to do something for her. You eagerly research and learn every little thing that brings her pleasure. Then you get it for her, even if it costs you money or great inconvenience. Your wish is my command, you feel, and it doesn't feel oppressive at all. From the outside, bemused friends may think she's leading him around by the nose, but from the inside, it feels like heaven. It is easy to those who do it. To love God and follow his path of life is not a demand, it's an invitation. The more you love him, the easier it gets to give over more and more and more of your will to follow the path lit by the lamp of his word. And what once seemed to be barriers are revealed to be guardrails on a path leading you toward true freedom. Let's pray. Lord, I just thank you for this reminder as we all struggle and strive in this world to do your will, and yet, Lord, as the song goes, we are prone to wander. We feel it. We're prone to leave the God that we love, drawn away by temptation to try and satisfy ourselves with the things this world has to offer. And so, Lord, I just pray that every time we find ourselves in that place of emptiness, that you would draw us back, that you would constrain us once more to you, Lord, that you would bind us to yourself, and that you would lead us through that constraint into true freedom. In your precious name.